Hello and welcome back to another episode of the PolitiBabble podcast. I'm Archibald Elliott, and as usual I'm joined by my wonderful co-host
Oliver Sykes.
and this time by a very special guest,
Jason Moorhouse.
So yes, we're back for another week of political intrigue and usual conversation. And obviously we're joined by the wonderful Mr. Jason Moorhouse.
Thank you.
And yes, here we are. So, Jason, Mr. Moorhouse,
Yeah.
if you were a cake, as we ask all our guests when they
Right.
come on this show, if you're a cake, what cake would you be?
Well, that is a challenging question because I'm not really a cake fan. So, given my limited knowledge, I think I'd go for cheesecake.
Why?
Just in terms of it's a traditional cake and it's a mix of two core ingredients. So, yeah.
Very good.
Which hopefully I am as well in terms of, I'm the representative of Aubrey Castletown and Maloo, and I'm out there trying to change things. So, two core ingredients.
Yes.
What a
So
push.
I suppose that comes on to an interesting point. You talk about Aubrey Castletown and Maloo, and I know your constituents are very important to you. What made you sort of become an MHK in the first place back in 2016?
It was an interesting one because I did my first degree in politics, philosophy and economics, and when I came back to that, it was like, whoa, what is the point of this degree? And I always thought I would like to go into politics, but I was waiting for that kind of opportune moment. And I always thought that when Tony Brown retired or resigned, whatever, I would give it a go. And he retired in July 2011. And I thought, what do I do? It's summer holiday time. I was a teacher. And I didn't want to actually start instantly and declare instantly. I thought you need to do the preparation and planning. And it was quite a sudden announcement. So I spent from his resignation day until A-level results day kind of working out what I was going to do and how I can make an impact in a month. Because basically that's all I had. I had limited money, I think about £300. And with it being a small constituency at that time, Castletown, I was able to go around every door 3 times. And I was only about 40 votes off actually winning. So it was like, wow, that was slightly unexpected. And so, when the chance came up in 2016, I gave it another go and spent slightly more, but not a lot more. And got in, which was good. And repeated that in 2021 when I spent a little bit more, but not a huge amount. I probably, out of all the candidates, I probably spent less. And then, here I am.
So would you, I suppose, say that it's not really a budget which matters, but more the politics itself?
I think it's recognising that anyone can do it, because there are so many obstacles in terms of you've got a job you're going to have to give up if you're successful, you've got other commitments that are going to have to be removed in terms of what you're dealing with, and just kind of the cost, because you ask people how much to spend on becoming an MHK and it's thousands and thousands of pounds. And I think even in 2020 it'd still be less than £1,000 spent, and in no election have I actually claimed the government money. So I've delivered everything by hand, and probably if I include a petrol price, it'd be slightly more than 1,000. But I think it's you should do it in a way that is believable and relevant. And for me, it's not spending a fortune. It's just kind of, as you said, having the right policies and listening to people and trying to respond accordingly.
Yes, well, I suppose we see in the States, for example, they spend many hundreds of thousands, millions on elections to elect. Each party would flood money into it, and they use different election vehicles as super PACs to get round election spending rules and all of that. Which I think, at least over here, I'm pretty sure we have an election spending cap.
Yeah,
and that we can spend.
Yeah, it's linked to the number of constituents, and again, because you're actually looking at over 5,000 people in each constituency, it's going to be a challenge to actually have a low budget, because you need one form of literature in terms of the stuff that's going through the door. And it's a matter of slimming that down, because my manifesto wasn't really a manifesto. It was basically a A4 sheet back to back. Whereas most people who were standing believed it was necessary to have a booklet of many pages and covering every single topic. And I was basically saying that unless I'm Chief Minister, what I can do is really respond at all times and try and get the best for the island and the constituency. And that's really what I went with. And the last 2 elections, it's been believable. Hopefully next time it will be equally believable. But that's really what my mantra's been.
Well, yes, I suppose I'm sure Oliver can concur with the election leaflets he receives through his letterbox. But I always remember there's usually, most of the candidates who said there's the booklet, relative number of pages, let's say 10, 15, and there's a lot of empty spaces in the booklet. And
a lot of nice photos.
A lot of nice photos and a lot of waffle within inside it, which don't really seem to add much. So I would say it's probably is. You can probably slim down. The Isle of Man's relatively a small amount. I suppose it's relatively small, and to have the greatest impact, the number of policies, as you said, with the backbench MHK, which you get in on, you don't need a whole 100-page booklet like the Conservative Party produced in the UK, for example. Yes, but on that point you mentioned about of the Chief Minister, do you think the current election way of electing the Chief Minister, there's been some criticism of it by it not being a publicly elected thing, more of sort of a private electorate. Do you think that that's working as such?
It's interesting on where you were at that time. In 2016, I had limited political knowledge. I was faced with 3 candidates, Kate Beecroft, who was the Lib Van person. Unless you're in Lib Van and had that clarity of thought in that area, she wasn't going to be probably top of your list. And then there was Alf Cannon and Howard Quayle, and it was basically listen to what they were saying and go with it. In 2021, because I had kind of 5 years background of the candidates, it wasn't really a matter of what they were saying, it was a matter of what they'd done.
Yeah.
And I think that was quite an important thing. But in terms of the electorate, you're actually looking at a very small number of individuals, and they're going to have very specific thoughts on those individuals from where they're coming from. And it's also interesting in terms of what you wanted from those individuals, because some of the people are wanting to become ministers, and that's going to influence how the process works. And I'm probably quite an odd individual from the point of view that I actually was involved in the current Chief Minister's plans in his campaign, and I then didn't become a minister, and I've still not become a minister. And whereas initially it might have been something I would have considered and possibly wanted, 2 years on, it's kind of, I've got a very specific niche which is quite interesting. And having been in now for over 6 years, I've got a skills base that allows me to kind of make use of the position I'm in. Whereas if I'd have been in this position 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been as good at doing these things, because everything's a matter of learning, getting the skills and refining, what you're good at.
Well, you mentioned a niche there. What would that niche be?
In terms of where I am now, I'm really a one-man opposition, that when it comes down to looking at the current policies, looking at what is happening on the island, I'm there with my little drum saying, why are you doing it in this way, and what alternatives are being looked at, and why? And it's such a privileged position to actually be in that position where you can actually go into the House of Keys or into Tynwald and ask any minister any question. And I was actually talking to someone one Tuesday afternoon after we'd been in Keys, and I said, I'm really quite exhausted this afternoon. And he said, of course you are. You've actually been questioning 6 ministers about key policy areas. And you think, gosh, that's quite a big thing to actually do. But, if you're in that position, you've got a chance to do it and you want to do it, then it's a great opportunity. So, it's just a niche I've fallen into. There was no plan. There's no kind of, I want to be the backbencher who asks these questions and looks at these areas, raises concerns, and tries to move things forward in a positive way. Because I would say that every question I ask is done for the right reason. I'm trying to make things better rather than say, you look stupid on this. If it is a kind of a controversial question or a question on the edge of where it should be that could make the minister look slightly less good than they normally would, I always make sure that the minister's aware of where I'm coming from. Because, it's not for me to actually get that individual to look stupid. It's for me to actually allow that minister to explain where they're coming from and hopefully change course slightly. And it's one amazing thing about Question Time that you're actually going with the 3 supplementary questions, but so often the minister will give you a chunk of information, either by accident or by design. You find yourself going off on a tangent, and it's so frustrating when the speaker or the president's kind of shifting you on because you've kind of got to that point where it's the next question.
Yeah.
It might be my question that's the next question, but yeah, it's still frustrating because there was an issue yesterday in terms of the MUA putting old-style meters into homes rather than smart meters. And I went through my original question and the supplementary questions. It's like, so why are you doing this? And then my next question was looking at the annual report. It was like, I was wanting to say, can't I actually ask him one more question? in this? I've got 3 here. And it's
just cut out 2 on the next.
That's it, because it is, a difficult one, because I think, as with everything, things work on systems, and usually you do get 3 supplementary questions. There have been occasions where I've been moved on quite swiftly, and that probably the most memorable one was with the Attorney General, was actually asking about the way in which the reserves are being invested, and there's a procurement process happening, and it shifted basically how we're looking after the money. And I'd spoken to the Treasury Minister, I'd asked the Treasury Minister questions, I'd been into the department and asked, and it was like, we can't discuss why we've changed it because there's a procurement process taking place. And I was saying, well, I'm not wanting to get involved in the procurement process, but I want to know why we've had a series of ideals that we've used for the past 20 years to invest the island's money, and we've changed those dramatically, but there's been no reasoning. So I thought, I'll ask the Attorney General. So I asked the Attorney General, could I actually get from Treasury the reason for this? And he gave quite a general answer. And I was there with my supplementary, and the President went, next question. And I was like, no. But yeah, that's just the way things work at times.
But would you say that's a slight flaw in the process, almost? Because it's very good to question the public figures, but when they can give extraordinarily evasive answers which don't actually answer perhaps the question at hand, or what's at least the intended point at hand, would you say that hinders one of our democracies?
It does, definitely. And you end up having to create a question that is bigger than it should be, because you've got the question you're wanting to ask plus the material from the previous answer that you're wanting to bring into it, and that's giving the minister more of a chance to avoid all the key bits, because he can take just a key element and provide an answer and then move on. And yeah, it was quite frustrating again yesterday with the question of what's been happening in schools, and I was wanting to get real clarity in terms of what's happening next in terms of just the delivery, and we were left kind of with that cliffhanger, and you think, does it end there? Well, it did yesterday, but because I can put another question in, it can restart in 2 weeks' time. And again, that's an issue, that the questions have got to be in on Monday at 12 o'clock for the following Tuesday. So even though something will come up in Tynwald and Keys on the Tuesday morning, you can't get your extra relevant question in on that until 2 weeks' time, which is quite a gap away. And it usually isn't an issue, but if it was something quite time specific, you'd be thinking, yeah, this is frustrating.
So I suppose on that point of the almost a frustration with the time limits for questions, would you say you would perhaps push for a way to have that amended? Because it does, as you say, seem quite ludicrous to have something which may even come up midweek, and you can't, or even on the Tuesday for the next week. You think you need to have a week? It seems relatively odd.
There is the opportunity to kind of ask the urgent question, but that again is something that is down to the President or the Speaker to actually decide on, and it's one that it's looked at in terms of the national interest, it's looked at in terms of being time specific, and they will often go with the argument that it's not going to make a dramatic difference whether you wait 7 days or you wait 3 days for this question. So it's an interesting one. And it's, again, arguing at the periphery that most of the time you get to ask the question when you want to ask it. It's just that kind of niggly bit when you kind of want that bit extra. It's back to the cake question. I want a bit more of that, please. So, it's perhaps, I suppose you need rules, and you also need that kind of freedom for Mr. President and Mr. Speaker to decide. There's nothing to actually stop them going for the fourth question. And as we saw with Mr. President with the question on the reserves, there's nothing stopping him going for no supplementary questions. And I guess in a way it creates frustration at that point, but it creates that variety. And, there's nothing to prevent you from bringing a different question with a similar link at, a future Tynwald or Keith. So, you've still got opportunity if you look on the positive side.
So an interesting point I'd like to ask on is obviously they've got the island plan at the moment and the sort of the economic strategy, and it's quite ambitious. And a lot of the public often in public forums are saying that we need more action, more reform. There's a lot of reports, there's a lot of strategies, but is there actually much sort of change on the ground? So my sort of question is that people say that politics over here runs sort of slowly. Do you think that that's the case? Do you, as being in a department member, sort of seeing inside government and now sort of stepping back, you can sort of really see how things are?
It's definitely a big concern that we've spent money on getting an economic plan, which is good, but my concern is it's been done by a accounting company that actually really looked at us as a location in the British Isles with 80,000 people, whereas that plan would be fantastic for somewhere like Durham. In terms of the Isle of Man, we've got so many small specific issues that need to be dealt with in the immediate future in terms of housing, aspects of mental well-being, lots and lots of things. And we actually look at a plan that's going to be deliverable over a number of years, over an election period. So in 3 years' time, we go knocking on doors and people are saying, what have you done in the last 5 years? It's going to be a case of, we've got a great plan for what comes next. And there was only me and Mr. Speaker who voted against the plan in Tynwald in October. And when we actually put the plan and the economic strategy together in January, there was, again, a very small number of us who voted against it. And it's that concern that it's good to have that economic plan, and being economists, you're thinking, you've got some recognition here. But at the same time, we actually speak to businesses, families, individuals, we've got this kind of credibility gap that they're saying, well, what are you doing for us? And it is that real concern, and it's one of my advantages of being a backbencher that I can go and talk to Mrs. Smith on a Thursday morning rather than being in Combe. I can go and see a business on a Monday afternoon. I can do all these things, and my timetable's absolutely cram-packed full. But I'm getting a completely different message, and I'm saying completely different things in the House of Keys and Tynwald to most of the members, because as you were suggesting there, if you're in the Council of Ministers, if you're in a department, you tend to be looking at things from a very specific angle. You're looking at it through the perspective of a policy, a series of things that are going to be implemented over the next few years which will improve certain areas. And I'm looking at the overview and saying, hold on, we've got real issues here. And it was particularly challenging with regard to the budget, because the budget is kind of that big plan that looks at everything. And this was the first budget I've actually thought, I'm not sure that I can actually support it. In terms of the way in which it's taken from the reserves, it's not helping the people that need it. Okay, we got the 10% rise for benefits and things, but there's a lot of people in kind of the squeezed middle, a lot of businesses that are really struggling and really find it difficult to move forward. And, I have a question next week for the Chief Minister in terms of, we're going to get 5,000 extra jobs on the island, but in terms of the local housing market, when were you last talking to local estate agents about house prices and rents? And it's all right having these politics being kind of handed to us, but it's got to be made specific to the island, and we've got to make sure that there is the housing, there is the healthcare, there is the education, and all those things that are really, really important. Because if people aren't happy today, they won't be here tomorrow, and that's the concern, that we can bring 5,000 extra people in, possibly 15,000 people in, but whilst that's happening, there's the exit, and many people are leaving.
I have a question, getting back slightly a bit different from what you were saying on the. You're saying you can obviously speak to Mrs. Smith on Thursday rather than being in Coman. Do you think that's something that Coman's missing? Because they're almost, you see government, and most of them, I think, yourself, I think it's now Rob Callis is the only one without a departmental position. All are almost, they're no longer on the government payroll because of the increase in the base pay. But do you think that's a large problem, that they're not actually they don't have the time to go out and speak to the people whose policy it affects? Because as we're such a small island, I think the individual person is of greater importance. Yeah,
and it's one of those things that really comes through in terms of, I've spoken to my MHK, but he's a minister. And as a minister, he can't push this like you can push it. He can't ask a question publicly. He can ask a question in private. He might be able to get a response, but he doesn't seem to have the time or the ability to take it forward, whereas you've got extra time. Even though I'm living in Ramsey, can you help me move this forward? I actually asked a question last week about the wildlife park, and people going, that's a long way from Castletown. But it's that issue that at the moment you've actually got no MHK who's not a minister north of Garth, and and I'm in that privileged position. I think it's one of those things that when I chose to be or try to be an MHK, I've been teaching for many years, and I want to kind of retain that community link and do a similar thing, because people always say, it must be so different to teaching, but it's just the same in terms of the preparation, the questions, the answers, the reading. The same people contact me, and it's just just the same. It's just a slightly grown-up version of teaching.
I thought it was going to go down a line of, it's just like teaching because everyone's still children here.
No. I wish they were. I wish they were. That is the worst thing. If you've got the most horrible child, at the end of the lesson, you make up and you move on. If you've got an adult and you have a bit of fallout or crossed words, they build the barriers and they retain those for weeks and weeks and weeks and possibly never get over it. And that was the biggest difference about working with children and adults. And it still surprises me that you can say something to an adult, it's like, whoa. Yeah. You can say something to a child, and at that moment it kind of, he shouts at me, but they kind of get over it, and the following day it's back to normal. And adults aren't like that, which is quite bizarre.
Yeah. So going on the point, and you said about sort of Coman, speaking to sort of local estate agents and sort of having that activity with the community. They had I think they've had one previous in the previous government, Coman on the road kind of thing, and they had one before the island plan to sort of assemble that and gather opinion, and obviously they've got the now conference kind of thing. What's your thoughts on the government conference every September?
I think it's good, but I think it's again that it attracts a narrow range of people. It's attracted people like us with that interest. It attracted some business people because they wanted to make contacts. It was attracting people who wanted to become members of the Legislative Council. It was a kind of a tick box exercise. But in terms of the small business who was kind of man who was, or lady who was struggling to get everything done in 24 hours, they hadn't the time to go. In terms of someone struggling to feed the family and get by, it was not really relevant for them. And I think that's the issue. And in terms of being a politician in Aubrey, Castletown and Maloo, I go to the local school, I go to a coffee morning, I go to the local shop, and it's in those places where people say, can I just have a word with you? I've got this problem. Whereas at those conferences, it's kind of the grown-up world again, and you don't really raise things like that unless it's kind of to make a point. So I think it's good to have those things, but I think also we need to have that different form of communication. And having been a teacher and kind of known many of my constituents since we were young, they just kind of were able to do that. But some kind of MHKs in some areas don't have as many coffee mornings or as many schools and as many events, and so they don't get those opportunities. And yeah, I'm pretty lucky.
Well, perhaps one solution, I'm not sure what you think on it, perhaps is it a solution of having more MHKs? Arguably, so more MHKs, but limiting the amount of departmental roles. You have a sufficient number of backbench MHKs who are purely backbench MHKs.
You say that being a departmental member or incumbent stops that sort of constituency link. Would you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. But having said that, I do think it's so important to having been in a department. I've actually spoken to several people who want to be on the Legislative Council in the next election, and I was saying to all of them, if you get the chance to be in a department, because you find out then how it works. And I was lucky because I was in both health and infrastructure, and in terms of basket cases, they're almost there. They have all the challenges, they've all the changes, they're public facing. Anything that goes wrong is out there. And I worked in 2 departments. I worked under 4 ministers, and in that 4 or 5 year period, it was incredible. But what I learned then allows me to do what I do now, because even though I ask a lot of questions, a lot more emails actually go out, and I tend to ask questions because I get information, but it can't be in the public domain. And by asking the question, you actually get that response. And it's quite interesting. I asked a question yesterday to one minister, and I spoke to the officers last week and was saying, we know where you want to go, but please be careful with your wording because it could create other issues. And the minister produced an answer, and it was just like, oh, he should have just said that. It was kind of, because having been in that department and that, you just think, that's quite interesting. And I think it's anything, it's good to be there for a period of time because you learn so much, but at the same time, you don't want to become stale. And it is a difficult one with being MHK because it can become so intensive and absorb so much of your life. And we've got this kind of negative perspective on the island that government's big, and government is big, but in terms of the number of MHKs, you've just got 2 in 12 areas. And it's good, I enjoy working with Tim, but sometimes you think Castletown in 2011, where you just yourself, you were kind of working with the neighbouring MHKs who were pushing things forward. There are advantages of that because, no matter how well I get on with Tim, how well I got on with Mr. Kajin, at the end of the period, you've got to kind of take the gloves off and fight for your position. And, in terms of 2021, I thought that was one of the best things about the election, that at no time did Graham and myself have any crosswords. We'd worked together for 5 years. We were both going for the same votes, and we kept it, really clean and honest and open. And, in some areas you kind of get that personal fight, and it looks bad in terms of how you're responding to people, and people don't like that. And I thought, good on you. We actually worked together right to the end, and I think that's a good thing. And hopefully the same will happen again in 2026. But in terms of the number, it's difficult, and you've got that issue with the Legislative Council that they're there to do a role, and that their role is really to actually try and scrutinise and move things forward. And I think we kind of, it's still not in the best place there. And potentially, as we move forward, they will have a role that is scrutinising and ensuring the government is in the right place. But it's back to that issue when it comes down to things like the budget. Should the Legislative Council be actually there asking questions? And it was quite interesting with the last budget. I think there was only Mrs. Mask that actually raised questions and asked about it. So, yeah, an interesting one. But it's a really interesting job because you can do as much or as little as you want. It's like being your own boss, and it does absorb you. And, in terms of my working day, I've got well over 200 emails most days to deal with, and my timetable I'll get up at 5 o'clock every morning, work through the day, and it's just dream. I love it, but you couldn't do that forever. You just get bored and stale, and so we'll see what happens.
An interesting point there. You sort of talk about the Legislative Council, and I think in the past few elections there's been much talk about really the Legislative Council's position, the sort of reforms that should go on there, that seems to sort of influence a lot of sort of the elections and what's discussions, rather than actually what do you sort of plan on doing in the Legislative Council? Do you think it's more important the candidate's position on how the Legislative Council moves forward, or what they sort of intend on sort of doing?
I think it's a difficult one, and it's each individual involved in the process has got a slightly different opinion on what that individual should be doing. And I went to the presentation on Monday evening, and it was quite interesting to watch Conor Keenan, who's actually tried to become an MLC previously, and having been through the process, his answers were so clear and specific and linked to what the successful candidates will actually do. You thought, yeah, that's refreshing. Whereas some of the new candidates are still kind of slightly at sea in terms of what does this involve, and their answers were kind of much more general. And then you have the 3 sitting members who again were able to make reference to what they'd done, and it was still an interesting one, because in 2016, when we kind of discussed it following Liz Vane recommendations, I was really kind of pro-Legislative Council in terms of this is a link between governments. If you've someone in the infrastructure department, they're going to ensure that between the election, between one government finishing and the new one starting, you've got that continuity. You've got the civil service being questioned, things being looked at. But now I'm kind of thinking, what is the role of the Legislative Council? Do they actually do anything worthwhile apart from just checking the bills we've put through? And would it perhaps be better just to have a couple of lawyers there just checking to make sure it makes sense and is doable? Because, it's...
Well, see, I generally take... I did take, I suppose, a similar approach as the usefulness of a Legislative Council, because it wasn't directly elected by the population. It wasn't so arguably electioneering as such. But I do see the slight problem in the fact they don't really seem to properly scrutinise things in much the same way as perhaps, because they have, many of them have departmental roles, and they're almost, again, part of the large government body within that Tynwald, it seems, where it seems every member is sort of governmental, even though they can technically have positions on places outside of their departments. They're still very much, with the Island Plan, for example, the Island Plan encompasses all of the departments. They're quite limited on what they can go and say, because they want other people to let their bit go through. That's it. So it's sort of...
But it was most clear with me after the last election when Jane Paul Wilson and Caitlin Brennan became members of the House of Keys, and were then looking for 2 new candidates. And my big requirement was really to try and find a new Laurie Hooper, because between 2016 and 2021, he was absolutely fantastic at getting the piece of legislation and just looking at it with new eyes. I spent time going through it and thinking about bits and pieces, and he'd come with something and go, wow, that is what, we should be doing. That's how we should be looking at it. And we've got no one like that at the moment. And in terms of the candidates who are putting themselves forward, I'm not sure if there's anyone with that skill. And, to actually scrutinise the government and scrutinise that legislation, you need real ability and real skills. And, Laurie Hooper had that as a backbencher. And, I hope he's doing the same thing in Coming. But, there were times when I went in with a level of clarity, and I used to just listen to him and think, I can actually see what you're saying, and that isn't as it should be, and that section needs to be changed as you're recommending. And that's really what the Legislative Council should be doing all the time, but I'm not sure they are.
I do think Laurie has sort of Mr. Hooper's now been sort of, you could argue, bought out by Coman, but I don't feel personally that he's doing a better job at scrutinising. I think he was much better in his position outside of government, because he did, as you say, do a very good job scrutinising. Now I think he's sort of become one of the men in grey suits, as you could sort of say. That's my and
it's the same with Minister Edge as well, because they made question time so brilliant in the previous government, because we're kind of 3 of us who were kind of would go for things, and even though we might only get 3 supplementaries each, that was enough to kind of really make progress. And it's part of a learning process, and I think the people who went in 2021 are getting better at it. And, you know, the question we had yesterday on these 600 calories primary school meals, that was good because I think 6 members coming in asking questions and really pushing the minister. And yeah, it takes time to actually get the skills and get the confidence, and yeah, and I think that's coming through now, which is making it more interesting.
Well, it lends perfectly into another question, which is, as you're obviously a former teacher, so you had experience within the education sector on the island. What do you view of the island education now?
It's quite an interesting one. And in the past few months, I've kept going back to where we were in the late 90s. Because in the late 90s, when you actually did the league table of the schools in the British Isles, all the secondary schools in the Isle of Man were in the actual top 30. And, you know, there was a real kind of a desire to push education forward, to be progressive, to really kind of be at the forefront of things. You're going after doing your exam marking. And with doing the international stuff, we seem to have kind of become slightly more traditional, and we've perhaps not got the same enthusiasm, and things aren't perhaps progressing as they could have done. And it's quite an interesting time in terms of the way we move forward in terms of the new school, just in terms of the challenges, because I still go into school on Castle Russian on a regular basis, do things like junior achievement, and it's quite interesting to kind of see that kind of 6 years on, the environment has changed, the teachers have changed, and yeah, kind of initially I was still going back into work sort of thing, and now it's kind of just another place I visit once a week or whenever, and it's a difficult one because ultimately the education is the most important thing that any young person can get, and there seems to be a number of children who aren't getting the support, they aren't getting access to what they should be getting access to, and whether it be mental health support or support within the school. And I think it's I don't know if it's down to resources or just teachers just so busy doing everything else. It's difficult to get the issue with the issues linked to the strike, which have created tensions and problems and reduced options, and you know, it's a difficult environment, and teaching is challenging at the best of times. But when you bring all the extra requirements in, all the extra tensions in, it just becomes something that can break quite easily, and it's quite an interesting one. It's one of those things that when I spoke to Alf Cannon after the election, he was kind of looking at the ministers. I said, in terms of education, Dr. Alex was so good because he was a healer. He was trying to actually look at schools in terms of making them kind of areas that will be supportive and go forward, and solutions would happen there. And I said, whatever you do, make sure you get someone of a similar background, of someone of similar abilities. Because if you have confrontation, if you have conflict between the schools and the ministry, it's just a disaster for all involved.
I suppose even from my experience in schooling, it does seem to have almost, as you said, in the late 90s, it was sort of really high in the league tables. It has seemed to me to very much go almost a downward slope, and throughout my time in schooling. And I do find I think it's a shame on the policy side, on what it seems to be, there's more bureaucracy within teaching.
Huge amounts,
and I think that sort of hampers the teachers because they spend so much time ticking these little boxes to jump through all the little hoops which don't add anything to the child's education. Where the teacher would be much better placed as a member of teaching staff doing what they do and teach, really, than do all this other stuff.
That's it, because it's an amazing place. We've actually got a group of young people, and all of those young people have got so much potential. And in terms of actually ensuring that every child reaches that full potential, we've got, as you suggest there, so much bureaucracy, so much form filling, and so much other stuff to deal with. It's a matter of teaching a lesson and getting to the end of the day and moving on. And it's quite sad that, and that's why it's perhaps nice looking back and then looking at the present with an element of horror.
So would you say perhaps you would go more, perhaps champion more into the education sector than you do currently? So can you have much of an effect on the policy?
I think it's one of those things that just in terms of being an MHK, you're in a privileged position. You can go and talk to officers, you can meet with the minister, you can ask questions, you can bring motions forward. So you've got those opportunities. And I did bring a motion about 2 years ago about looking for ways in which young people could actually be given that support. Not the pure academic ones who are going to university, but those who are choosing different options and trying to find ways forward. And the department is still looking at that, but it's one of those things, it takes so long to get change. And in school, it's a kind of, I've got 6 lessons today and I've got to get this done. And that's how my life is still kind of based. And it was quite odd the first year after the last election. I just was running because I knew how fast time went. And so many members were going, oh, it's the end of the first year now, and it's like, yeah, but
we haven't done anything yet.
Yeah, that's it. And I'm kind of now seeing we're coming towards the second year coming to an end, and even though it's kind of a 5-year parliament, that last year falls away so quickly because people start to kind of electioneer, and it's kind of pulling things together. So we really got 4 years, and we're actually halfway through, and all we've really got is a plan for the future, which is quite concerning.
Yeah.
But if I'm correct in education, lots of the education changes that can be put through aren't legislation-based, they're departmental-based. Yeah, the
department has quite a lot of freedom. And it was interesting with the New Education Act, which never progressed. We kind of had all kind of this desire, there was the desire to shift things forward and move it in a certain direction. There was that kind of, the link was lost between the department and head teachers and teaching staff, and it was one of the things that Minister Allinson did was kind of pause that and said, let's go back to the basics. And it was quite an interesting conversation we had in Keys, because Minister Allinson was still kind of pushing that initially. And I said, this is time for healing, and we need to actually look at the schools and let the head teachers, let the teachers decide what is best for the students and see that's the way forward. And Chris Roberts-Shaw actually stood up and then made a speech and said, the most incredible thing has happened this morning. We've actually seen the divide between the official response to the minister and what a former teacher is saying in terms of what can be done. And it was a kind of difference between what should be done and what can be done. And he said, we need to take a step back and actually look at kind of the healing process and get things to move forward in a good way. And I think Dr. Alex went away and listened to that. The education bill was then kind of put on hold, and there's that kind of movement towards resolving issues in school. And we kind of back in that questionable time of strikes and conflict, and hopefully that can be sorted, we can move on. But
is that a slight problem within the almost ministerial portfolio? Because often I think Mr. Allison and Mr. Edge, they moved into the portfolio without having much prior educational area, almost as a speciality. And if we look at something like the UK government, for example, sometimes they put ministers in who were junior ministers in the department, they shuffle them around. But if they're going in and they don't know, especially on the island where it's so small, they don't know the ins and outs of our education and the problems and the things we can do and what's not working and what is working, would you say then it hampers them because they have to spend the first year or 2 years getting to really know it, and by that time it's on to the next election?
But perhaps some adds that it's a conflict of interest, for health and etc.
That's it. And it is quite interesting that Minister Edge was a Bursar at Ballacamine for many years, so she has actually got that background and that awareness, and I think that's been useful. And at the same time, even though Dr. Alex isn't in health, he's a Treasury Minister who can actually look at health in a more compassionate, in a more professional manner than perhaps some Treasury Ministers would, in terms of he's got that awareness of how health works. So I think it's difficult to actually say we need this level of knowledge, but that level of knowledge can be useful, and it can help things move forward. And as you were saying, in terms of that conflict, and possibly, you go to direct things according to your preconceived ideas, which could be outdated and quite frankly wrong. So it's nice to actually bring new eyes in, but at the same time, to have a little bit of experience and knowledge can be good.
Well, there is obviously the other argument that runs round of bringing new eyes in. So it's a critical argument against the ministers and also, I suppose, the civil service. So I shan't want to get you in hot water with that. But that the ministers can then have, obviously, our opinions get shaped by the information we receive, but actually it's the civil service that run the country. It's been a long running since, I suppose, Yesminster came out as a wonderful sitcom, that it was the ministers give you 5 options and 4 of them are bad, and the one they want is the good one. They say, here are your 5 options, and you don't think, oh, there's 6th option or 7th option. You think they're the 5 options. I'll pick the one that's best, even though it's not necessarily the best.
Yes. Yeah, and it was quite interesting that when I was new to one of the departments I was in, and the minister said, I'm now happy with that, and the CEO stood behind him and said, I'm not quite sure whether you are, Minister. Let Mr. Moorhouse just say his line again. And so I said the line again and thought, you were shifting him. And the minister then said, yes, I'm happy. And the chief executive said, I am too, Minister. Let's move on. It was just kind of that same thing. Yeah. But the officers have been in that position for many years. They've got that expertise. They kind of aware of the operations, and to a certain extent, given their responsibility, they need to be ensured that the minister's got that level of knowledge. It can be worrying that you've got a democracy where the minister is shifting in such ways, but if you're going to have highly paid civil servants who have got expertise in certain areas, then they should be listened to. So, yeah, it is scary, but there is justification for it.
Oh yes, I suppose I take perhaps a slightly more critical view outside of the whole system, because I see the government and obviously the civil service, and the civil service hires the next set of civil service, and it seems to be a reason perhaps why it's so slow moving, especially in something like education. I have an interest in the in the education system,
and I think the problem is that politicians want to get change, and officers want to de-risk it. And back to kind of the initial meetings I had in the department, it was a case of, what do you want to achieve? So we did all the stuff on the big sheets of paper, and then I said, how long will this take? And it's like, this is going to take 3 years roughly, Mr. Moorhouse, because we have to work through what is actually taking place now, what we've planned to do. And I thought, well, in 5 years' time, there's an election. I wasn't aware COVID was going to happen in the intervening period. So, yeah, it is a difficult one, and it's why being a minister must be so challenging. Because you go with your kind of, you've kind of got the free spirit, you've got the ideas, and you want to bring change, and there's someone there saying to you, if you do that, this could go wrong. Now, as a politician, as the lead, you can take us down that road, but can't take this warning on board, and
it's why I suppose in COVID it was such a shock to see everything. The mechanics of government, the cogs, seem to move at lightning speed compared to their usual.
That was amazing.
I think something like that happening in key areas where they need to be dealt with. I think, at least in the short term, you can experiment with things. Do they work? Because if you're flipping it round, rather than spending 5 years de-risking it, and it might never be risk-free, and actually trying it, okay, it failed, right, we'll go back to how it was. And
obviously public opinion was split a lot of the time on a lot of the decisions that government made, but government stood by most of their decisions.
And in the end it worked, because they made a decision. They didn't say, there's a bit of public backlash from a few vocal people. Well, we're going to keep our decision, run it out, play it out, and then we take the flak. If something goes wrong, we take it. I think that's what's missing in a way.
But it was so good, because I was actually in infrastructure and health at that moment. So I was able to kind of see the issue in terms of health with the oxygen, and then go to the meetings in infrastructure and say, how can we do this? And we got the oxygen machines coming in. It was like, wow, things are really happening. And it's kind of politicians are at the table and suggesting things, and things are happening, whereas before it's kind of officers kind of providing the guidance. And that was so it's incredibly special. And that's one good thing about being in a department at the right time.
Yes.
It was phenomenal. But it was also scary because she was just given such scary information. The first meeting we had in health, in terms of the number of people on Ireland who would potentially die through COVID, was like, and I can remember driving home that night thinking, given the population of the island and the number of people who are going to potentially die of this, it's going to be people I know, members of my family, and that was... And at the same time, to kind of keep things within normality, and you couldn't go, this is going to kill us all, and around the streets, it was... to actually have that extra level of information was a privilege. And, it's going to be the interesting thing on the COVID report, that they're actually looking at the situation several years on, and they're going to be looking at why those decisions were made, but you can never actually perfectly get an accurate reflection of what happened at that moment, because it was all being done to respond to something that was just arriving.
Yes.
And, when it was coming down to things like ordering the PPE equipment, there was that kind of warning that we actually had some stuff in the lockers for many, many years because of the last threat we had. And are we just going to buy all this stuff, and it's going to cost us hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it's going to be the next big disaster for us? And it was a case of, no, we've actually got to do this because this is what the people need now, and this is the best solution. So, it was, real privilege to be there at that time.
Excellent. Well, I think sort of looking at sort of going forward, as we've reflected quite a bit on the sort of past, I suppose, what are your main aims sort of nationally, and then sort of locally in your constituency? What sort of you really wanting to sort of drive forward over the next, sort of end of the political, the parliamentary term?
I think nationally I would like to get more recognition of the problems that business and people are currently facing. I think at the moment Comyn have got such clarity in terms of a national plan for the future without actually looking at the intricacies of today. And it would be so good just to be able to click my fingers and say, let's get this done now. I'm not asking these questions just to waste time. I'm asking these questions to actually get you to think in Comyn on a Thursday about what these situations are and actually potentially change. And in terms of the constituency, I just want kind of, again, to open up opportunities. And, when you look at a place like Castletown, help the commissioners and the traders move forward. So it is the place to be. And it was interesting yesterday in terms of the figures we were given from Manx National Heritage, how by getting that extension to Castle Rushen opening in November time, it made a real difference to visitor numbers. And by trying different things and moving things forward, it's an exciting place to be, and people want to go to those places and enjoy them. So you just kind of move things forward.
Well, do you mentioned the island plan there? I did probably try to I did not mention this earlier. I thought of it. Yeah. Do you think it will work?
No, and that's my greatest concern, that we've actually got something that is so high level and it's operating in a different sphere to what the people and businesses are operating in. And if I was in charge and I could say, what should we be doing? We should actually be focusing on ensuring that local businesses can expand, that we can ensure that local people actually have their needs met. So we're actually sending out that positive message so more people want to come naturally to the island, more businesses want to grow on the island, more businesses want to come here, rather than kind of having a strategy to bring people in, bring businesses in, which is kind of being done in a false way. I think if we could do it in that organic, natural way, it would work much better. I think if we were part of England and we're located in the northeast and northwest, it would work perfectly, because people can just move into the area without having to look at their bank accounts, having to change their Tesco card. They could get a house because there's a range of housing, a range of prices, a range of options. In terms of the children's schooling, again, there's the range within a small area. And when you come to the Isle of Man, you're making a big decision in terms of your housing, your career, whatever. And I don't think the actual economic strategy recognises that. And to make the leap to come to the island is probably bigger now than it's ever been, and there's no recognition in the plan that that's to happen. So I'd really like to go back to basics and say, what are the local people needing to expand local businesses? What are the businesses who want to come to the island needing to kind of come here and focus on that rather than focus on this high level stuff that may never work?
But with the, you say, to grow the local business and what the people need, do you have an idea of what those needs are and what could grow?
Yeah, it's quite interesting just in terms of how open people are about what the challenges are in terms of operating a business, in terms of tax changes, some of them quite small, some of them quite significant, just in terms of marketing, just in terms of things that would have an impact on their business, the business around them in the local area. And also people are quite specific in terms of their needs. And, you know, in terms of health, and it's good at the moment that things like the waiting lists are being tackled, but yeah, it's actually looking, rather than looking up at the stars and kind of following what might be the good thing, actually looking at all the amazing people we have, all the amazing resources we have, and saying, let's make the most of those. Because it goes back to the hospital just in terms of, in January, there were over 500 people who didn't turn up to their appointments. If we could get half of those to be going,
that would tackle the further issue.
That's it. The performance of the hospital will increase 5%.
Oh,
it's just
on that point, a very spot question. Would you then support a charge for missed appointments with the NHS?
Not in the first instance. I think in the first instance you need to find out why people aren't going.
Perhaps like a three-strike.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be
if
something.
They don't have reason or they don't contact. They just.
Yeah, I think it needs to be something that's considered. But if you've got over 500 people who aren't attending, there must be a small number of repeated reasons.
Yes.
And if those reasons can't be tackled, then you need to kind of look at charging. But in the first instance, we need to find out why people aren't turning up.
Yes.
And if it's something like transport or the cost of transport or parking or whatever it is, if it's something that's solvable, let's get that solved and get people into the hospital and get them sorted out. But
it's another problem I foresee with bureaucracy. To even manage something like that, it'd be the people would have to tick the right boxes and all that, rather than perhaps the old days where the receptionist would be, why can't you? Couldn't get transport, and it's all sort of.
But the issue is that each consultant who's waiting to see someone has then got a gap. So it might not be within his remit to send an email out to make a phone call, but he's going to have a personal assistant who he can say, I'm supposed to be seeing this gentleman or this lady out for the next hour. Could you just give them a call, please, to find out what the issue was? Because presumably that person, if they're still on island and still require that treatment, they're still going to fit back into this at some future point. So let's find out what the reason is today. So, and it seemed quite frustrating that the minister was saying, we haven't got the resources to actually find the solution to this problem. It's like, of course we have. Those people, it's like going back to me in the classroom. If the class didn't turn up, you can be finding out why they hadn't turned up. Had there been, was the timetable wrong? Was there an issue in terms of the year group? There's some specific reason that's caused that, and it's the same with the hospital. It's not just people just can't be bothered going today. Well, there'll be a small number, but not over 500 of them.
I have an interesting question. In a lot of people's manifestos for the 2021 election, and pretty much all candidates were going on about housing. And I was looking recently, and I'm not sure it was on the island plan. It was sort of the sort of agenda, and it was saying how the big pieces of legislation on housing aren't going to be for sort of several years away. And everyone was going on about housing. I may be wrong, but there's only a couple of officers actually on the working for the board, the Housing Communities Board. Is that not, for me and sort of people that want to stay here, that want to potentially have a house here, and the current sort of climate with the pricings, how is this not being pushed sort of more? What do you know the reasoning behind why there's not much more?
A movement towards doing something. And I think Chris Thomas has been rather wise by becoming the infrastructure minister, because he went from being kind of the individual with a couple of officers in the background to support him to the actual minister of a department with far more resources. But it's back to the point of being a backbench that probably two of the biggest things that have happened in housing was the first-time buyer stuff, which was really the consequences of a motion I brought in January 2021, just in terms of the structure we've got now, the support we've got now is not right. Can the department go off and look at this and respond to Tynwald with some action? And they went off and came back with that, and it was really quite enlightening that Chris Thomas then, his kind of initial thing was kind of linking back to what Mr. Moorhouse had brought. But I did bring a similar motion a couple of months ago about the cost of public sector housing on the Isle of Man. That we've got a complete removal of reality from the way the rents are actually charged. Because in 2019, if you'd have been a couple without children, you could have both earned the minimum wage working full time and earned an extra £2,500. Now, if you are a couple with no children, from the 1st of April, you'll earn £10,000 too much to qualify for public sector housing.
That's it's positively insanity.
It is, and it's simply because the minimum wage has gone up and the thresholds haven't changed since 2019. So I brought the motion saying, I know that you actually look at this, but before May, you must come back to Tynwald with new thresholds. And they're talking about shifting them up by 15-20%. It's not enough, but it's the first movement in nearly 5 years, which is box ticked if we can then get another one next year and the year after. But that's one good thing about being a backbench. You can bring a motion if you work with the minister and the department. You can actually get things done in a faster way than the department, because the department tend to just keep looking over it and thinking about it and waiting for the opportune moment. Whereas if you as a backbencher say you must bring this back to Tynwald by May,
they then have to. Yeah,
that's it. So yeah, it's a good thing, but the housing market is a real concern, it's a large problem. I think as Oliver and I were sitting and doing Max Radio budget program afterwards, and we looked at the budget, and even if you look at minimum wage and all of that, the thresholds where you start paying income tax haven't increased, but they'll increase the benefit system where people surely should keep more of the money they earn rather than having to go government and then dribble back to them. If you increase the threshold at which people start to pay, you're really it's not helping the richest in society, it's helping those with less in society and gives them more of their own money to keep. And they increase benefits, they won't increase the threshold at all, even given inflation. That's perfect. The only problem is that when the low thresholds go up, everyone benefits to the same degree. So,
but then they're cutting it back at the top end anyway now.
So there's ways to balance. And again, that's an interesting one, just in terms of we're the place that we're encouraging entrepreneurs to come to, the high-paid, innovative individuals, and we started to cut at the top, and you're thinking, will that make a difference?
Well, it's almost, some people were raising, what's going to happen next? Should we then also, they weren't saying, should we then also, like sarcastically, they were saying, should we then also look at the tax limits where you pay, I think it's 160 for a single individual. And I think we didn't need in the budget even, I think, to increase that top amount and cut back on the personal allowance if we spent our money like it was a household. We spend within our means. And I think I think you mentioned something on this concern about the structural deficit.
It is a concern that we do view ourselves as a government, and we spend as a government, and we've got bureaucracy as a government, but at the same time we're a small island state, and we should be kind of looking at how every penny is used. And when we're cutting through the reserves at the level we're going through them, it is a massive concern, because it takes so long to actually rebuild them. And at the moment, the stock market's close to its peak, and you're thinking, what's going to happen in the next 12 months, the next 2 years, the next 3 years? It's unlikely to keep going forward. It might do, but there are no guarantees. And if we are using the reserves and actually also they're going down because of market conditions, it could be a really tricky 5 years, which,
I suppose perhaps they take the belief, like the 1920s stockbrokers on Wall Street, it only just goes up. Perhaps that's it.
Perhaps, yes.
So I think that covers most of our questions. Thank you very, very much.
No worries at all.
Coming on. Yes, it's fabulous to have you.
Thank you very much. It's
It's been very enjoyable,
Very enjoyable.
interesting.
Yeah, it's very
yeah.
interesting.
Politics is interesting. I think the problem is that most people don't recognise how it affects their life, and it's their daily life and everything they do. Because people will still say when you knock on the door, "Oh, politics is nothing to do with it. It doesn't involve me." But yeah, everything from their wage to their health care to the children's education is going to be influenced by some politician.
That was Jason Moorhouse speaking to us, MHK for Arbury, Castletown and Maloo.
Thank you very much for joining this week's episode of PolitiBabble. If you want to come on to our show or you have any sort of comments, please do email us at politibabble@gmail.com. You've been
PolitiBabble.